So my name is David Hughes, and I've been working in agricultural technology research for 30 years now, every day thinking about how we can produce the food that we need in the most sustainable way possible. And my current role is all about how new technologies can play a part in that. So I'm a creature of the future, if you like, thinking about how food production might be in the years ahead. But I'd like to start off today by reflecting a little on the past. So I regard agriculture as humanity's most important life support system. It's sometimes tempting to take it for granted a little, but fundamentally, if you have no food and no access to food, then you are in serious trouble, right? Nothing much else matters. Now, fortunately, the world's farmers have done a pretty good job over the last 100 years or so in producing enough food to feed the rest of us. Okay, so even though the world population has ballooned at an exponential rate, global food production has actually accelerated even faster. We've got some good data on that, going back to the 1960s, thanks to the United Nations that I've replotted out here. So you can see that since 1961, global food production, the blue line at the top, has actually increased about fourfold, whereas the human population, the red line underneath, has only increased about 2.5-fold in comparison. And you can see that the gap is actually increasing. So the world has never been better able to feed itself than it is today. Furthermore, this massive increase has been achieved at constant global farmland, which means that almost all of this increase is due to increased yields thanks to better technologies. So today we've got better chemicals, better seed genetics, better animal genetics, better fertilizers, better machinery, better information about what's going on in our production systems, better ways of integrating all of those technology spaces together. But it's not just about food quantity. So there is good evidence that the quality of our diets is improving too. So this is taken from a major study published in Nature Food a few years ago, looking at the healthiness of diets around the world. Comparing diets in 1990 with diets in 2018. And you can see in almost all places around the world, the healthiness of diets has actually increased. The only exception to this is in sub-Saharan Africa, and that is due to an increasing consumption of sugary drinks. So by some measures at least, the world's food system is not bad and getting worse, but it's actually better than it's ever been, and it's improving. However, we do face some serious challenges, of course. In particular, the impact that our food system has on the wider environment. 4 areas of particular concern I would highlight. The first is pollution, the ability of some agricultural inputs to move beyond their site of application to do damage elsewhere. In particular, I think, pollution associated with fertilizers that can catalyze the formation of algal blooms, as you can see, which can create dead zones in many coastal regions around the world. Then we have greenhouse gas emissions, of course. Now, agriculture is in a relatively unique situation here, being both a major emitter of greenhouse gases and being particularly sensitive to the effects of climate change, things like rising sea levels and shifting climatic zones, and the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. We're also experiencing a biodiversity crisis at the moment as well, and agriculture's major contribution here is in the destruction of natural habitats and wild environments in the creation of new farmland. And some farming systems around the world are actually damaging the soil upon which food production actually relies. There's lots of different ways in which soils can be compromised. They can be compacted, they can be eroded, they can be contaminated with toxic materials. They can be mined of the essential nutrients that plants require in order to grow. Their microbiomes can be compromised. Their carbon content can be eroded. So soils are delicate and fragile, and we need to take better care of them. Now, some people suggest that our food system is somehow broken. It's not fit for purpose, and nothing short of total system transformation is required to put things right. Now, these people have a point, right? But I think when we talk about system transformation, it's really important to be clear about what we would like our system to transform into. And of course, given my role thinking about the future of farming, I've given that a bit of thought. So, what are the properties of an idealized food system? Well, first of all, obviously, it needs to produce enough food to feed 10 billion people. That's the point of the food system. But there is much more to it than that. The food produced has to be accessible to everybody. And again, that might sound obvious, but it places two perhaps less obvious constraints on the system. The first being a cost constraint. There's no point in producing plenty of food if people can't afford to buy it. The other constraint is that it assumes there's a functioning distribution and supply chain between point of production and point of consumption for every human on the planet. The food itself must be of high quality, of course. It needs to be safe and nutritious and so on. Production efficiency must be maximized, and input supply must be sustainable. There's an awful lot to unpack here, but just very briefly, we should minimize the use of inputs where we can, but where we must use inputs, they must come from renewable sources, preferably products of the circular economy. We need to think about energy and labor, less tangible inputs. Where are they going to come from in the future? We need to think about waste reduction right along our food supply chain. We need to think about land as an input into food production and how we can squeeze the amount of land that is required to create more room for other ecosystem services. I think in the future we'll need to think about the production of non-food commodities as well. Where are all of these vital industries actually going to get their carbon-based raw materials from, if we are serious about stopping pumping petrochemicals out of the ground? Currently, the only way of producing those raw materials at scale would involve photosynthesis, which implies that plants are going to be involved, right? But where are all those additional plants going to grow? The damaging impacts of farming must be minimized. I've mentioned these things before. I've added operator safety to the end here because I also think that too many farm workers are harmed by farming operations at the moment. The system has to be robust and resilient to disruption. So not only the obvious foreseeable disruptions like climate change, but if the past few years have taught us anything at all, we need to be better prepared for less foreseeable events, so-called black swan events. The system has to be economically sustainable too, so that all members of the food system can make a decent living. If not, what is their incentive? Particularly worried about farmers here who tend to be squeezed in the middle of the food system. And finally, the system must be, and be seen to be, socially responsible and acceptable. So this is quite a list, isn't it, really? It's very obvious to me that no single organization could possibly have all of the answers to all of these challenges. Lots of things have got to come together around infrastructure and investment and policy and trade and regulation, cooperation, innovation, collaboration, societal attitudes. However, I do think there are parts of this picture where the application of new science and technology can make a serious difference. And of course, I've given that a bit of thought too. So this is how I see it. So in these orange boxes here, hopefully you can recognize some of the mega challenges that I highlighted on the previous slide. Now I think, from Syngenta's perspective at least, there are 10 major potentially disruptive technology areas attracting a lot of attention, a lot of investment at the moment. And Syngenta, I think, is heavily invested in 7 of these areas in the green boxes here. So our seeds division is all about optimizing crop genetics. Our crop protection business is all about things like pest control and biostimulants and biofertilizers, either through synthetic chemistry or natural chemistry or biomolecules or extracts or living microbes. The solution space is much more diverse now than it ever used to be. Our digital agronomy teams are very much interested in diagnostics, analytics, decision support, and precision. And we've been talking about regenerative agriculture for many years now. So what we can do is map these technology areas onto the challenges where we think the biggest benefits could be manifested. But the problem is, it's an extraordinarily complicated picture. There is no simple one-to-one mapping here. In fact, the technology areas themselves are not independent one from another, and neither are the challenges. And the situation becomes even more complicated if you include the other 3 technology areas I alluded to, where Syngenta is perhaps a little less invested. Suffice it to say, though, that if there are advances and breakthroughs in any of the areas in the green boxes here, we can directly expect that to link through to benefits in our food system, but the way those benefits will be manifested are likely to be quite complicated. Now, I'm not going to say anything more about these technologies on the slide here at the moment. We'll learn a little bit more about some of them in the rotations after my piece. But instead, I'd like to give you a little glimpse behind the scenes at some different technologies that are revolutionizing agriculture, only in a more indirect way. And these are the technologies that are helping companies like us invent the the sort of technologies you can see on the screen. Okay, now you will be aware, of course, that generative artificial intelligence burst onto the scene less than 2.5 years ago, actually, with the launch of ChatGPT and other large language models. Now, the way these models work is actually quite straightforward. What they're essentially doing is predicting what the next word would be in a sequence. So, in this trivial example here, we can all recognize that a man could give a dog any one of a number of different things, but the fact that the dog is muddy makes bath a particularly good choice. And these algorithms go through this same kind of thought process. They don't understand what a bath is, or what a dog is, or what mud is. They just know that those 3 text strings are statistically associated from its training set. Okay? So it's not magic, it's not consciousness or sentience, it's clever statistics run across a huge amount of data. Now, imagine if we could come up with a similar model that doesn't understand words and language, but instead it understands chemical structures and biological information. So if we're working in, say, a herbicide discovery project, and we've made samples of these 3 molecular structures on the slide here, and we've tested their biological activity, imagine if we could put this information as like a prompt into one of these kind of models and ask the model to predict new chemical structures that haven't been made before that might have even better biological effects. Well, this works. We have such models routinely deployed in Syngenta. They're not superhuman in their ability, not yet at least, but they do work and they come up with good ideas, which means we operate them in kind of co-pilot mode at the moment. So for every chemical discovery project in Syngenta, we are making and testing substances that have been invented both by human scientists and by AI working together. Now, these type of models tend to work very well for problems that can be framed as a what comes next in the sequence problem, or what might fill in the gap type of problem. So another area where this may work extremely well is for DNA sequences. So our Seeds organization have just instigated a major collaboration with a company called InstaDeep, who have developed exactly this kind of model. They call it AgroNT, trained on 10.5 million DNA sequences, trillions of DNA letters, across 48 different species of crops. So what we're hoping is that we can ask questions like, what changes could we make to the DNA sequence of this particular crop, maybe changes that are accessible using gene editing technologies, that will have beneficial effects on traits like disease resistance or drought tolerance or yield or nutrient density, whatever it might be. So we're trying this out right now. Back to chemical structures now. There is much more to getting a successful product from a chemical structure than just getting the biological activity right. You've got to get all sorts of things coming together in just one single molecular structure. So for a start, it needs to be safe. Safe to humans, safe to the crop, safe to non-target organisms in the environment. It needs to be sustainable, so it can't move beyond its site of application. It needs to break down relatively quickly into harmless byproducts. We need to be able to manufacture it at a reasonable price, and so on and so forth. So how do we do that? Well, these days, we have different AI systems that can actually predict many of these important properties just based on a consideration of the molecular structure. So no need to make a sample and to test it. We can predict it from the structure. Which means that for any molecule we can consider making, either designed by AI or designed by humans, we can score the potential performance of those molecules against the important criteria we are seeking to optimize. And then we can combine the individual scores together into a single, what we call multi-parameter score, which represents the probability of success of that molecule, of combining good activity, good safety, and good sustainability in one single molecular structure. So we can zoom straight in on the molecules with the best chances of success, and those, of course, are the ones that we would prioritize for synthesis and testing, just to make sure the predictions of the algorithms are indeed correct. Another major megatrend happening recently is the use of autonomous systems and robotics in laboratories. So robots are everywhere these days. In the top left-hand corner, this is a chemical synthesis robot making new molecules that have never been made before. In the bottom left-hand corner, this is another type of robot that's setting up a biological screen. So you can see what it's doing. It's just punching out little discs of leaf tissue and placing them in the wells of this plate here. So this is a completely tedious task that used to have to be done by hand. And a more recent trend is the use of AI systems combined with robotic systems to assess the results of biological screens. So on the right-hand side, you can see an early-stage herbicide screen that we use. So in other words, we've got little plants growing in the wells of these plates in the presence of a chemical. And if the chemical compromises the growth of the plant, then that's a potential herbicide, right? So that's what we're looking for. So you can see the camera moving over and photographing every single well in that plate. And this is what the output looks like. So you can see the photograph itself in the top left-hand corner. Beneath it is a computer rendition of exactly that photograph, which is then analyzed pixel by pixel, and the plant growth within that well is then accurately quantified. So you can see some wells in the plate towards the right-hand side where plant growth has clearly been compromised, and that's what we're looking for. That's good. So doing it this way makes it much more accurate and much more objective than a human eye could ever be. So just to recap then, so we have AI systems that can design new molecules that no humans ever thought of before. We've got other AI systems that can predict the properties of those molecules and prioritize them for synthesis. We've got robots that can make new molecules, other robots that can test those molecules, and other robots combined with AI systems that can evaluate the results of those tests and feed those results back into the design process. So we have AI and robotic systems helping us at literally every step of the invention process. So this is a real step change for us, right? Helping us to invent better, safer, more sustainable chemistry much faster and much more efficiently than ever before. Okay, let me just quickly recap. So first of all, there are some elements of our food system that are better than they have ever been, which is good news. But there are still some really significant challenges, particularly around environmental sustainability, and indeed the degree to which a changing environment could compromise our ability to produce food in the future. Thankfully, there are many technologies being developed with some energy that could actually help us with this, and there are other technologies which could accelerate the development of the technologies that will be put into the hands of the growers. Now let me just leave you with one final quick thought. So, the world's population is forecast to grow strongly between now and the middle of this century, mainly due to what's going on in Africa. Beyond 2050, though, it levels off really quite quickly before maxing out in the early 2080s, which means that, to a certain extent, the end of the challenge is in sight. If we can make it through the next 25 years or so, able to produce enough food to sustain 10 billion people, a high-quality diet, whilst improving our environment in the process, then the pressures on our planet due to a ballooning human population are going to start to ease quite rapidly. So are we going to make it? Well, the next 20 years are going to be crucial, aren't they? This is an amazing time in human history to be alive. Thanks very much.